Hey everybody, welcome to the Guardians of the Galaxy season. I am Glazer of the Snap Judgments podcast. Today on Snap Take, we're looking at Nebula. I've got 9 decks for you that run Nebula and 1 that should beat her. First off, Nebula is a 1/1. Each turn, your opponent doesn't play a card here, +2 power, except for the turn you play this. That gives Nebula the power to be like a 1/11 if the opponent just ignores that location. It also immediately makes Killmonger meta again. This is going to be a extremely, extremely powerful card. Is it meta shaking? Debatable. It just becomes the auto 1-drop that you need to find reasons not to run in your deck. Cool? Super strong card. Get ready to use it. We're going to start off by looking at other creators' versions of the Nebula deck. We're going to start with Eggs for Sale. Eggs is an awesome content creator. You can find her over on Twitter or Twitch at Eggs for Sale. The deck that Eggs is suggesting is a fundamentally lane control, but it's a lane control with a little bit of move. It's real cool. It's got cards like Kingpin in order to kill opponents' cards, and Stegron to knock things into Kingpin. Also, that's quite the Stegron alt. But how it wants to use Nebula is it fundamentally wants to get Nebula and armor down, and if it can storm that location, it basically wins it. Nebula is going to get real big at that point. You're going to win a lot of stuff. It can also use Nebula into Rocket. Nebula into Rocket should be quick power very easily. As you've got locations locked off, you hopefully get Kingpin down around 3-4. You can knock cards into Kingpin with Juggernaut and Stegron. Again, very powerful. You can play Nebula, and after Nebula, you can drop a Negasonic, which means that they can take out that Nebula power, right? But they're going to have to sacrifice a card to do so. If they are trying to play into Nebula, Professor X or Spider-Man on 5 do an awfully good job of turning that off, and Gamora is just the biggest thing you can do on 5 as long as you can get the right location. Daredevil and Stegron make that likely. This is Eggs for Sales, Nebula deck. We got Wham Bam Shangalang, the Shayad deck. We do a Shayad deck every single week. Shayad is one of my favorite deck builders. You'll notice that this deck is fairly similar. It is a junk deck, though. So the idea of this deck is if your opponent doesn't have space on the opposing side of the board, they can't counter your Nebula. You drop a Goblin. You have a Hood already vipered over there. You get debris. They don't have space. If they don't have space, you drop your Titania and send it over there, so on. They don't have space. Your Nebula gets huge. You take your Titania back. You win the lane. A free lane. You add in Professor X. That's another lane. They do something big that is going to cause you trouble. That's what Shang-Chi is for. And they should have a bunch of your junk on their side of the board to Spider-Woman down some strength. In addition, if they have all that crap on their side of the board, you can either, if any of that ends up on your side in your way, you can Carnage what's bothering you away, or you can keep it there and Mojo to get a 2/8 in that spot. Sweet power to this deck. Straight up, this is going to be one of the first decks I try. I don't usually like junk, but this version looks so cool. I have to try it. I may add a Sentry just to make my friend, the Jolly Roger, happy, but this is a sweet deck. Next up, we have an Educated Collins deck. Educated Collins is running like half of a Surfer build here. This is a lane control. He's calling it Storm Control. Basically, you've got Nebula, and you've got 2 ways to really prevent opponents from being in your Nebula's way. They are Goose, which says unless you have a bunch of cheap stuff, going to get big, and Storm, which is going to win a location fairly often. There is no armor here, so your Nebula is going to be at risk. If armor is as popular as I think, this might not be as good. But it's got a lot of really high power stuff lower in the curve. It's got multiple ways to close off that lane with Storm and Goose, and then multiple ways to get extra power into those lanes. This deck is obviously going to be very powerful. Next up, we have our boy Vin Kelsier. He didn't even bother putting the last 2. He is one of the originators of the Sandman ramp deck. Before it was called Sandman Ramp, he called it Wet Sand. The idea here is that Sandman and Wave really limit your opponent's ability to play cards. If they can't play cards, they can choose to play them all in Nebula and then lose to your cards like Doctor Doom, or they can let your Nebula get really big and just lose that location. Either way, you're really, really strong. There's also quite a bit of synergy between Nebula and Lizard here. Nebula in one lane, Lizard in another. It's very unlikely they're going to be able to play 4 cards in that Lizard lane while stopping Nebula from growing. That means you're getting a 5 at a Lizard instead of a 2-1. Really, again, cool build by our boy Vin. For these last 2 spots, I might be looking at Leader, and I would piss Vin off and probably just play Psylocke, not going to lie. You could also go Leader America Chavez. If you're interested in this deck, Vin will have an article over on Snap.fan. He is the main writer there, and he will have an article that goes over how he would build this particular deck. It's Guest Gaming, my streaming buddy, full-time content creator, has a sweet Destroyer Atuma version of Nebula. Basically here, you're dropping a bunch of cards and challenge your opponent to figure out where you're going to play. You'll note a lot of these decks have Storm and Spider-Man. This is another one. It can go Storm into Jessica Jones to win a location. You can go Nebula into Storm to win Nebula into Armor into Storm to win another location, and then still get in there with Jeff. It can say, oh, Nebula has gotten big. I'll Professor X. It can go at Atuma in a lane and then drop Professor X on top of that while your opponent is busy contesting your Nebula. And once all of these things have happened, if Nebula is contested, then your Destroyer is suddenly an extremely powerful card. 615 is still one of the higher stat lines in the game. Absolutely sick combos. It's Guest Gaming is awesome. Gotta check them out here on YouTube, on Twitter, and on Twitch. It's Guest Gaming is a brilliant deck builder with phenomenal energy. And now we are on to my decks. I think my boy Safety has my favorite version of this, but that's going to get its own video probably tomorrow because I'm pretty sure that he's nailed this deck. We're going to talk more about that later, though. This basically takes the deck that was the best deck in the format for this season and says, let's add me some Nebula. If you're adding Nebula, you want to add Armor and Goose, I think. Ways to get that Nebula more powerful, right? At that point, I cut Killmonger and then ran with the deck. I'm keeping the Shang-Chi, even though I have armor, because my goal for Shang-Chi here is, well, back in the day, before Zabu, you used to play Shang and Enchantress in your Sarah control decks, and it wasn't like a thing, right? You would just Enchantress on 5 and Shang on 6 if you really needed to, and just shut that game right on down. That is still a viable play here. It still works really, really well. You'll note America Chavez, a few of the top players in the game. I believe it's actually Lambie's suggestion that Chavez be in this deck because there's multiple cards, Nebula and Sarah in particular, Bishop in particular, that you want to see on curve at their point in the game. And seeing them nice and early is what America allows. It's like 5 or 6% each, right? And that really, really adds up over the course of a game. And this should be a good way to get a lot of power and control your opponent. My next deck is Nebula Surfer. I hit Infinite with Surfer. I changed a couple cards here. The cards I mainly changed was I changed Lizard for Armor, and I changed Nova for Nebula. Nebula just being bigger and being an extra great target on that Storm lane. Cool. The other card I added was Shadow King. I dropped Shadow King into this deck. Shadow King has a chance to be meta right now. I expect to see a lot of Sarah control that's running cards like Bishop, and I expect to see a lot of Nebula. Let that Nebula get as big as you want, drop a Shadow King on it, and the problem has been solved. In addition, if you don't want to add Shadow King or don't have Shadow King, you can add Rogue, stop all the ongoings, the Devil Dinos, the Darkhawks. You can add Groot. Groot is usually a 4/6 in this deck. That's about as big as Bishop gets in several of the other versions of this deck. It's pretty good. Negasonic has obvious synergy with both Nebula and Storm. And Coulson is my last backup plan. I just like the variety Coulson gives you. He gives you optionality that can help you win 8 cubes. But this is what I'm going to do with the Sarah Surfer deck, which was, again, the deck, the meta deck that I hit Infinite with last season. these are the changes I'd make. I'm really excited to try Shadow King out this season. I think he's a super big sleeper card going forward. Um, it's also going to be good if you don't see Luke Cage in your high evolutionary games. Fair warning, Shadow King's pretty solid. Next up, we have Nebula and Shuri. This was Sunspot spot, and Sunspot's great if you have She-Hulk. Nebula says your opponent has to either play in a location, right? Your opponent keeps playing in that location and Nebula stays small. But then you can make that the location you drop your Shuri Red Skull in. It basically, if you've already got armor there, right? It basically says, let's get big. As they're contesting Nebula, you're then winning other lanes. Your Typhoid Mary, your Shuri, your Red Skull, all your other big stuff. They're busy contesting one spot. If they want to contest it, you can always give that spot up and then drop 24 and 24 power in another lane for an easy win. Or drop 10, 12, and then another 12 over 3 turns, which is less than 44, but it's like 32, whatever. It's still a really, really strong play, right? Like all of these different strong plays really add up, play together. Remember, Nebula has that synergy with Lizard. The only real counter synergy in the deck is Sauron armor. So if you draw armor late, you're just not going to get to use them if you played Sauron. No harm, no foul. This deck should work incredibly, regardless. I'm a little actually worried about how good this deck looks. All right. Next up, Thanos Zoo. This is basically saying I'm going to play 1-drops. It's got 4 1-drops, and then it's got the 6 Infinity Stones. In addition, it's got the Goose to protect. It's got Spider-Man and Professor X to lock down lanes, and it's got Valkyrie for that buff and cheat a lane. Occasionally, you're going to have to pass turns. You often do in Thanos decks. She-Hulk is great for that. You very rarely play Thanos here, but basically what you're doing is you're playing a standard Zoo game. You're dropping a bunch of low-cost cards and watching them make your opponent's life difficult as they gain power through various means as other options and locations get closed down. This deck had Titania in this spot instead of Nebula. That's still great. I like Nebula here a little more, and I think all the other cards are fundamentally necessities here. These are my pick for the 4 best 1-drops in the game, and then any other 1-drop that would be in competition comes out of Thanos' stones. So this is extremely powerful. It's a great way to get Khazar and Blue Marvel going. Let's run with that. The last deck we're going to look at, I like this deck a lot. This is my Nebula Quake. You might have noticed if you've been watching for a while. I think Quake is baller and needs to be played with more. I'm going to find a bigger streamer than me and convince them to just roll stuff with Quake because, like, this is going to be crazy. You can drop Nebula, and if they're competing for that lane, right, storm it. Awesome. Quake it away, and then, like, you win another location for free because that stormed location is moving. You can still storm in Juggernaut. You can Nebula under Goose or under Armor. You can Nebula into Negasonic. Do you want Wave? Not always. Wave is here, but if you don't see Captain Marvel on turn 5, you're very often not going to have a better turn 5 play, right? Than just Wave into Doom and She-Hulk. Is that ever a game? No, but that power, you're dropping 24 power on that last turn is pretty good across several lanes, especially if you didn't have Captain Marvel. There's not many better plays available to you. There's a lot of options for what this deck can do. There's a lot of power in controlling what locations go where. This is going to be one of the first decks I try. This is a take off of there was a deck that was like 66% that I was talking about last week. It's down to like 57% and like a 0.4 win rate, which is more like in the normal very good deck range, but this is at least a normal very good deck, and you gotta try it out. I'm telling you, you can win with this deck once you learn how to play it. The last thing we have is Counter Nebula. I want to beat Nebula. Everyone's talking about this deck. So, our boy Safety Blade made the deck. I tweeted it at Safety and at Cam Best last week. I was like, this deck is broken. The stats are broken. And since then, Cam Best, Spessy, Mobile Gamer, Bootman, TLSG, you name them, they made a video talking about how this is one of the best decks in the game. This deck is completely incredible. There's one change. This was running Nightcrawler in a one spot. I decided that I need Killmonger. I want Killmonger as an answer to opponents' Nebulas. Cool. I've got Enchantress for when they have armor, and Killmonger will take care of the rest. So I only want one drop. That's Korg. Korg's still here. Cool. Some people don't have Jeff. A lot of them are just running Cloak in that spot. Works just fine. Stats are a little better, a little less viable into bad locations, but otherwise works really, really well. Everything else here should be fairly obvious. You've got the Polaris, the Jeff to trigger Miles. You've got the Black Bolt to trigger Stature. And then you've got Rock Slide and Korg to help our boy Darkhawk go. This deck is extremely cool, extremely versatile. I think this is the best deck in the game, and I think adding Killmonger for Nightcrawler makes it even better into the meta we're about to see. All right, that is all of the Nebula Day 1 decks. Tomorrow, you get what I think is the very best. Stay tuned for another Snap Take. See you then.